In 1850, California applied for statehood, once again provoking a fiery controversy in Congress because California's Constitution outlawed slavery. South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun was ill, so ill that he missed 4 months of the debate over California's admission to the Union. On March 4, 1850, still too ill to speak before Congress, Calhoun asked another senator to read a speech he had prepared, in which he said, "I have, senators, believed from the first that the agitation of the subject of slavery would, if not prevented by some timely and effective measure, end in disunion. The agitation has been permitted to proceed until it has reached a period when it can no longer be disguised or denied that the Union is in danger. You have thus forced upon you the greatest and gravest question that can ever come under your consideration. How can the Union be saved?" Senator Calhoun called on the North to give the South justice, simple justice, and demanded that slavery be allowed to expand throughout the territories won in the war with Mexico. If not, he declared, the South would secede. Once again, the issue of slavery had brought a political crisis that deepened the gulf between North and South. Throughout the 1800s, the North had continued to industrialize rapidly. Factories turned out ever-increasing numbers of products. More than 20,000 miles of railroads carried raw materials to factories in the east and manufactured goods and settlers westward. Small towns like Chicago matured into cities almost overnight. Miles of telegraph wire provided a network of almost instant communication in the North. Immigrants from Europe entered the industrial workplace in growing numbers, many becoming voters with a strong opposition to slavery for two reasons. One, it might bring slave labor into direct competition with free labor in the factories and cost them their jobs. And two, it threatened to reduce the status of white workers who could not successfully compete with slaves. Unlike the North, the South remained a predominantly rural and agricultural society consisting mostly of plantations and small farms. The Southern economy relied on a few staple crops, predominantly cotton. 1/3 of the nation's population lived in the South in the 1850, but the South produced less than 10% of the nation's manufactured goods. While Northern railroads expanded, Southerners continued to use rivers to transport goods. Few immigrants settled in the South because African Americans, whether slave or free, met most of the available need for labor. The conflict over slavery rattled Southern society. In 3 Southern states, Mississippi, Louisiana, and South Carolina, whites were in fact the minority. While blacks dreamed of an end to slavery, Southern whites feared that any restriction of slavery would lead to a social and economic revolution. On August 8, 1846, Pennsylvania Congressman David Wilmot heightened tensions between the North and South by introducing an amendment to a military appropriations bill proposing that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall ever exist in any territory the U.S. might acquire as a result of the war with Mexico. The Wilmot Proviso meant that California, as well as the territories of Utah and New Mexico, would be closed to slavery forever. The Wilmot Proviso divided Congress along regional lines. Northerners had supported the proviso because they were angry at Southerners who had voted against internal improvements such as roads and canals. And they also feared that adding slave territory would give slave states more members in Congress and deny economic opportunity to free workers. Southerners opposed the proviso and raised complex constitutional issues. Southerners viewed slaves as property, and property was protected by the Constitution. Laws like the Wilmot Proviso undermined the constitutional protections of personal property. Southerners also feared that the addition of new free states to the Union would shift the balance of power in Congress permanently to the North. The House of Representatives approved the Wilmot Proviso twice. It was defeated in the Senate on both occasions. Some historians consider the Wilmot Proviso as the first round in an escalating political conflict that ultimately led to civil war. Meanwhile, as a result of the gold rush, California skipped the territorial phase of becoming a state completely. In 1849, California held a constitutional convention, adopted a state constitution, elected a governor and a legislature, and applied to join the Union. California's new constitution outlawed slavery, a fact that alarmed many Southerners who assumed that since most of California lay south of the Missouri Compromise line of 36 degrees 30 minutes, the state would be open to slavery. General Zachary Taylor, hero of the Mexican War, was elected president in 1848 and supported California's admission to the Union as a free state. Taylor also advocated the philosophy of popular sovereignty, in which the people of the individual territories, and not Congress, would decide the slavery issue in each state. Southerners, however, saw this as a move to block the expansion of slavery and an attack on the Southern way of life. They began to question if the South should remain in the Union. The 31st Congress opened in December 1849 in an atmosphere of distrust and bitterness. The issue of California statehood topped the agenda. Of equal concern was that the slave state of Texas claimed the eastern half of New Mexico territory, where the issue of slavery had not yet been settled. At the same time, Northerners were demanding the abolition of slavery in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., while Southerners were accusing Northerners of failing to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. As passions rose over each of these issues, some Southerners threatened secession, a formal withdrawal of a state from the Union. Henry Clay worked tirelessly to forge a compromise in Congress that would solve this renewed sectional crisis. Although extremely ill, Clay visited his rival in Congress, Massachusetts Senator Daniel Webster, and obtained his support on January 21, 1850. 8 days later, Clay presented to the Senate a series of resolutions later called the Compromise of 1850. Clay's compromise contained provisions to appease Northerners as well as Southerners. The terms of the compromise were as follows. To appease the North, California would be admitted to the Union as a free state. To appease the South, a new and more effective fugitive slave law was proposed. Measures that appealed to both sides included the issue of slavery in the territories of New Mexico and Utah would be decided by a majority vote among the settlers, or popular sovereignty. Congress would pay Texas $10 million to surrender its land claims in New Mexico. Northerners liked this because it limited slavery to the borders of Texas. Southerners liked it because it defrayed Texas's debt from the Mexican War. Finally, the slave trade would be banned in Washington, D.C., but whites were permitted to own slaves in D.C. as before. There would just be no new slave trade there. Henry Clay responded to this compromise of 1850. And such a war as it would be following the dissolution of the Union. Sir, we may search the pages of history, and none so ferocious, so bloody, so implacable, so exterminating, would rage with such violence. I implore, gentlemen, I adjure them, whether from the South or the North, to pause at the edge of the precipice before the fearful and dangerous leap to be taken into the yawning abyss below. Clay's speech marked the beginning of one of the greatest political debates in United States history. Within 1 month, John Calhoun presented the South's case for slavery in the territories. Calhoun strongly believed in states' rights over federal power and held the interest of the slave-holding South as his highest priority. 3 days after Calhoun's response, Daniel Webster offered his statements, an eloquent appeal for national unity. I hear with pain and anguish and distress the word secession, especially when it falls from the lips of those who are eminently patriotic. Secession, peaceable secession. There can be no such thing as peaceable secession. It is the great Constitution under which we live to be thawed and melted away by secession. No, sir, I will not state what might produce the disruption of states. What that disruption must produce would be such a war as I will not describe. Webster's speech would become one of the most famous in the history of the Senate. The Senate chamber was packed, and all were stunned to see longtime rivals Clay and Webster finally, for the first and last time, working together on the same side. In arguing so passionately for compromise, Webster alienated the Massachusetts abolitionists who supported him. Webster and Calhoun both died in 1850. Clay would die 2 years later in 1852. Despite the arguments of these great leaders, the Senate rejected the compromise in July of 1850, and no more would the great compromisers of Clay, Calhoun, and Webster be able to influence Congress and avert civil war. Discouraged by the defeat of the compromise, Clay left Washington. Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas picked up the pro-compromise fight and carried on. Douglas developed a shrewd plan to pass the compromise. He unbundled the package of resolutions and reintroduced them one at a time. Congressmen could now vote for provisions that they liked and abstain from voting for ones they disliked. The sudden death of President Taylor on July 9, 1850, also helped pass the measures because the new president, Millard Fillmore, made it known that he supported the compromise. The death of John C. Calhoun also removed one obstacle to the compromise. Without Calhoun's supervision, Southern senators could now vote in favor of Clay's individual proposals. After 8 months of effort, the Compromise of 1850 was voted into law. President Fillmore embraced the compromise as the final settlement of the question of slavery and sectional differences. For a moment, the crisis over slavery in the territories passed once again, but the relief was short-lived. The next crisis loomed ominously on the horizon: enforcement of the new Fugitive Slave Act. The passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, which was a component of the Compromise of 1850, surprised many by the harsh terms of the new law. Under the law, alleged fugitives were not entitled to a trial by jury, despite the Sixth Amendment provision calling for a speedy and public jury trial and the right to counsel. Nor could fugitives testify on their own behalf. All that was required to have an individual returned to slavery was a statement by the slave owner. Federal commissioners charged with enforcing the law received a bounty of $10 for each alleged fugitive they returned, only $5 if the individual was freed. Finally, the law dictated that anyone convicted of helping an alleged fugitive was subject to a fine of $1,000 and 6 months in prison. The Fugitive Slave Act infuriated many Northerners who immediately organized vigilance committees to send endangered African Americans to safety in Canada. 9 Northern states passed personal liberty laws which forbade the imprisonment of runaway slaves and guaranteed that they would have a jury trial. This violated both the Fugitive Slave Act and the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution. Northern resistance to the new law outraged Southern slave owners. In time, free African Americans and white abolitionists developed a secret network of people who would, at great risk to themselves, aid fugitive slaves in their escape. This network became known as the Underground Railroad. The conductors hid fugitives in secret tunnels and false cupboards, provided them with food and clothing, and escorted or directed them to the next station on the line. One of the most famous conductors was Harriet Tubman, who was born a slave between 1820 and 1821. Tubman made her break for freedom in 1849 when her owner died. She succeeded in reaching Philadelphia, where she became involved with the Underground Railroad shortly after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act. In all, Tubman made 19 trips back to the South, aiding over 300 slaves, including her own parents, to escape from freedom. Southern authorities offered a bounty of $40,000 for her capture, but neither she nor any of the slaves she helped were ever caught. Tubman later became an ardent speaker for abolition and was soon joined by another voice that brought the evils of slavery to the attention of many Americans. That voice was Harriet Beecher Stowe. In 1852, ardent abolitionist Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin. The book stirred strong reaction from the North and South alike and became an instant bestseller. More than 1 million copies had sold by the middle of 1853. The novel's plot was melodramatic, and many of its characters were stereotypes, but it delivered the message that slavery was not just a political contest, but also a great moral struggle. Readers tensed with excitement as the slave Eliza fled across the frozen Ohio River, clutching her infant son in her arms. And they wept bitterly when Simon Legree, a wicked northern slave owner who moved to the South, bought Uncle Tom and then whipped him to death. In quick response, Northern abolitionists increased their protest against the Fugitive Slave Act, while Southerners criticized the book as an attack on the South as a whole. The furor over the book had barely begun to settle when a new controversy over slavery heated the debate. That new controversy was tension in Kansas and Nebraska. Abolitionist feelings in the North intensified when the issue of slavery in one of the territories, supposedly settled by the Compromise of 1850, surfaced once again. Ironically, Stephen Douglas, the person most responsible for steering the compromise to victory, was the person most responsible for the resurrection of this issue. Douglas had long been working to organize the huge territory west of Iowa and Missouri. By 1854, he had developed a proposal to organize the area into a territory called Nebraska. Douglas's motivation? He was pushing for construction of a railroad between Chicago, his hometown, where he had significant investments in property and business, and San Francisco on the West Coast. To get this route, Douglas had to strike a deal with Southerners who wanted the railroad to originate in a southern city such as Memphis or New Orleans. Douglas was also eager to see the Western territories organized because he thought the expansion would help unify the nation. He also believed that popular sovereignty provided the most fair and democratic way to organize the new state governments. To Douglas, it seemed that popular sovereignty seemed an excellent way to decide whether slavery would be allowed in the Nebraska Territory. But Nebraska lay north of the Missouri Compromise line of 36 degrees 30 minutes and was therefore legally closed to slavery. Douglas assumed that the territory could enter as two states, one free and one slave, to preserve the balance of power in Congress. Douglas was convinced that slavery could not exist on the open plains of this territory, since none of the crops relying on slave labor could be grown there. But to win over Southern support for his plan, Douglas supported the repeal of the Missouri Compromise, which would allow legal slavery north of the 36-degree 30-minute line. On January 23, 1854, Douglas introduced a bill to Congress to divide the area in question into two territories, Nebraska in the north and Kansas in the south. If passed, this act would repeal the Missouri Compromise and establish popular sovereignty for both territories. Congressional debate over the bill was bitter and spilled out of Congress into the general population. With the help of President Franklin Pierce, a Democrat elected in 1852, Douglas steered his proposal through the Senate. After months of debate, the Kansas-Nebraska Act became law in May 1854. All eyes now turned westward as the fate of the new territories hung in the balance. The race for the possession of Kansas was on from both the north and the south. Settlers poured into the Kansas territory. Some were simply farmers in search of new land. Most were sent by immigrant aid societies, groups formed specifically to supply rifles, animals, seed, and farm equipment to anti-slavery immigrants. March of 1855, Kansas had enough settlers to hold elections for a territorial legislature. However, thousands of border ruffians from the slave state of Missouri crossed into Kansas armed and voted illegally. They won a fraudulent majority for pro-slavery candidates. These pro-slavery candidates quickly set up a government in Lecompton and issued a series of pro-slavery acts. Furious over events in Lecompton, abolitionists formed a rival government in Topeka in the fall of 1855. Violence soon surfaced in the struggle for Kansas. Anti-slavery settlers founded a small town named Lawrence. A pro-slavery grand jury condemned Lawrence's inhabitants as traitors and called on the local sheriff to arrest them, the entire town. On May 21st, 1856, a pro-slavery posse of 800 men rode into Lawrence to carry out the orders of the grand jury. The posse burned the anti-slavery headquarters in the town, destroyed the presses at 2 newspapers, and looted many of the houses and stores. Anti-slavery newspapers across the country dubbed this the Sack of Lawrence. News from Lawrence soon reached an abolitionist named John Brown. Brown believed that God had called on him to fight slavery. He also had the mistaken impression that the pro-slavery posse at Lawrence had killed 5 abolitionists. Brown and his followers pulled 5 men from their beds in the pro-slavery community of Pottawatomie Creek and mutilated them with broadswords. The attack became famous as the Pottawatomie Massacre. The massacre triggered dozens of other such incidents throughout Kansas. Over 200 people would die in the violence, and the state became known as Bleeding Kansas. The violence erupting in Kansas reached out and touched nearly every corner of America in some way, and in fact, even reached the floors of the Senate chamber itself. On May 19, 1856, Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner delivered an impassioned speech entitled "The Crimes Against Kansas," verbally attacking his colleagues for their support of slavery. Sumner was particularly abusive in his language towards the aged Senator Andrew P. Butler of South Carolina, sneering at him for his pro-slavery views and making fun of Butler's speech impediment. On May 22nd, Butler's nephew, Congressman Preston S. Brooks, entered the Senate chamber, approached Sumner's desk, and said, "Mr. Sumner, I have read your speech twice over, carefully. It is a libel on South Carolina and Mr. Butler, who is a relative of mine." With that, Brooks raised his cane and bludgeoned Sumner repeatedly over the head until the cane shattered. Sumner, lucky to survive the attack, suffered shock and brain damage and would not return to the Senate for over 3 years. Southerners applauded Brooks' actions and showered him with gifts of new canes, one of which was inscribed, "Hit him again." Northerners condemned the incident as yet another example of Southern brutality. The widening gulf between North and South held implications for party politics as well. The compromises that had been attempted from the time of the Wilmot Proviso until the Kansas-Nebraska Act could not satisfy either the North or the South. The tensions that resulted led to new political alliances. As the 2 regions grew further apart, old political parties were torn apart and new political parties emerged. In March 1855, Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, was frustrated with the Whig Party's shifting position on slavery. A staunch abolitionist, Greeley's Commons spoke out against popular sovereignty and were in favor of forcible resistance to slave catchers. Greeley issued a call to the Friends of Freedom to join a new anti-slavery political party, the Republican Party. Already split over the issue of slavery, the Whig Party was further divided in 1852 when General Winfield Scott became the Whig nominee for president. Scott owed his nomination to the Northern Whigs, and the fact that he gave only lukewarm support to the fugitive slave law alienated many Southern Whigs. Because of Scott's position, the Whig vote in the South fell from 50% in 1848 to 35% in 1852, giving the election to Democrat Franklin Pierce. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act brought about the demise of the Whigs, who once again took opposing positions on legislation involving slavery. Unable to agree on a national platform, Southern Whigs looked for a pro-slavery, pro-union party, while Northern Whigs also looked for an alternative. One alternative for the Northern Whigs was the American Party, whose members believed in nativism, or favoring native-born Americans over immigrants. Using secret passwords and handshakes, its members were told to answer questions about the activities of their party by saying, "I know nothing." Formed in 1854, the American Party soon became better known as the Know Nothing Party. The Know Nothing Party appealed to those who were dismayed by the large number of immigrants, particularly Catholic immigrants, who were entering the country. Surprisingly, the Know Nothings did well in the polls in 1854, but like the Whigs, they could not agree on the issue of slavery and soon split. The primary forerunner of the Republican Party was the Free Soil Party, which was formed in 1848. The Free Soil Party opposed the extension of slavery into the territories and failed to win any electoral votes in 1848, but it did win 10% of the popular vote. Free Soilers objected to slavery's impact on free white workers in the wage-based labor force upon which the North depended. Free Soilers detected dangerous patterns in events such as the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, the repeal of the Missouri Compromise. They were convinced that a conspiracy existed on the part of pro-slavery forces to spread slavery not only into the territories, but throughout the U.S. In February of 1854, in Ripon, Wisconsin, discontented Northern Whigs and anti-slavery Democrats joined Free Soilers to form a new political party. On July 6th, the new Republican Party was formally organized in Jackson, Michigan. Among its founders was Horace Greeley. The Republican Party was united in opposing the Kansas-Nebraska Act and in keeping slavery out of the territories. Otherwise, it embraced a wide range of opinions, and this allowed it to draw support from diverse groups and provided the party with the strength to win a political tug-of-war with the other parties. Initially, the Republicans' main competition came from the Know Nothing Party, but after events in Bleeding, Kansas, and the caning of Charles Sumner, the Republicans had the issues they needed in order to challenge the Democrats for the presidency in 1856. The Republicans chose John C. Fremont as their candidate. Fremont was the famed pathfinder who had mapped the Oregon Trail and led U.S. troops into California during the War with Mexico. Democrats nominated James Buchanan of Pennsylvania. He had been a minister to Great Britain and thus out of the country during most of the disputes over the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Thus, he had antagonized neither the North or the South. With John Breckinridge of Kentucky as a running mate, Buchanan easily carried the entire South, winning 45% of the popular vote in the country. Fremont, however, came in a strong second, carrying 11 of the 16 free states and winning 33% of the popular vote. The Know Nothing candidate came in a distant third. The meaning of this election was clear. The Democrats could win the presidency with a national candidate who could compete in the North without alienating Southerners. The Know Nothing Party was clearly in decline, and the Republicans were a political force to be reckoned with in the North. So just to kind of review the political parties between 1850 and 1860, you have the Free Soil Party, which was established in 1848. Their platform was anti-expansion of slavery and pro-labor. You have the American Party, also known as the Know Nothing Party, which was established in 1854. Their platform was anti-immigration and anti-Catholic. The Whig Party of old had been organized in 1832. Their platform was pro-business. They were divided on the issue of slavery. The new Republican Party of 1854 had a platform that opposed the expansion of slavery into the territories. And finally, the Democrat Party, which had been founded in 1840, it was actually the Democrat-Republican Party. They had just changed their name in 1840, had a platform that embraced states' rights, limited government, and they also were divided on slavery.